Hey, I'm Noam Weissman, and this is Unpacking Israeli History, the podcast that takes a deep dive into some of the most intense, historically fascinating, and often misunderstood events and stories linked to Israeli history. This episode is sponsored by Andrea and Larry Gill and by Tony Felsen in appreciation of his high school buddy Connor Coffey, a native New Yorker, true mensch, and an avid Unpacking Israeli History listener down in Tennessee. If you want to sponsor an episode of Unpacking Israeli History, or if you just want to say what's up, get in touch with me at noam@unpacked.media. Before we start, as always, check us out on Instagram, on TikTok, on YouTube, all those fine social media places. Just search Unpacking Israeli History and hit the follow or subscribe button. Okay, yalla, let's do this.
על הקמת מדינה יהודית בארץ ישראל. היא מדינת ישראל.
We, the people of Israel, are prepared and anxious to meet the representatives of our neighbors without any preconditions.
There are people in Israel and elsewhere say it's impossible to make peace between the Arabs and Israel or the Jewish people. I think they are wrong.
Today, I am going to tell you about the least famous but biggest scandal in Israeli history. You heard that right. Normally, I love a juicy scandal. The more ridiculous, the better. Like the not-so-serious ones, though. Remember that week when the entire world was convinced that Kate Middleton was hiding something terrible because a picture of her may or may not have been edited with AI? I remember this non-story dominating the headlines for days. But some scandals, they have the power to break a nation, to destroy trust in institutions, to raise questions about who exactly is at the helm of your country. Some scandals come with a body count. And that's the kind of scandal we're going to be talking about today. A scandal so toxic, so untouchable, it became known in Hebrew as Esek Habish, the rotten business. In English, euphemistically, it's known as the Lavon affair of 1954, after Pinchas Lavon, who was Minister of Defense at the time. Whatever you call it, the scandal eventually ripped apart Israel's ruling party, paving the way for a seismic shift in the country's political leanings. Some of you may have heard of the Lavon affair, but I have found that the vast majority of people I randomly ask, hey, quick question, have you heard of the Lavon affair? They look at me blankly. So this is a story that will blow your socks off. Is that a phrase? I don't know. Anyway, on top of the seismic shift, there was another, far more personal cost. And that, to me, is going to be the crux of this story. Not the political fallout, but the personal one. The lives it claimed, the dreams it punctured, the painful questions it raised among Jews who now doubted the fundamental promise of the Jewish state. No matter what will keep you safe. That was the promise. It's an extravagant promise, impossible to fully fulfill. Let's be honest, Israel hasn't always kept Jews safe. That's not a criticism of the state, so chill if you think it is, or even the promise on which it is founded. It's just a reflection of the fact that the Jewish state is made up of humans. And sometimes humans make catastrophic decisions, sometimes without even realizing it. Sometimes circumstances spiral well out of control. In 1954, Israel was a plucky 6-year-old country, still rough around the edges, but shiny with promise. To so many of the refugees and survivors who flocked home in the 40s and 50s, the Jewish state was more than just an insurance policy, a place to go when other doors had been slammed shut. It wasn't just a rescue mission. It was a miracle, the climax of an epic 2,000 years in the making. That is the hinge on which this story turns, because none of it makes sense unless you remember that the Egyptian Jews at the heart of this tale were idealists, young and in love with the idea of the Jewish state. And when you're in love, it's hard to see past the stars in your eyes. The basic outline of the story goes something like this. In 1954, in his first move as Egypt's new president, Gamal Abdel Nasser began negotiating Britain's exit from his country. Since the 1880s, the Brits had controlled everything in Egypt, and Nasser was over it. But the Israelis were alarmed, because without the 80,000 British troops stationed along the Suez Canal, very little was stopping Egypt from building up its army and invading Israel with its shiny new Soviet weapons. So Israeli military intelligence sent a sleeper cell of young Egyptian Jews to sow chaos by setting off small, harmless bombs in public places built by or associated with Western powers. This is the key. If all went well, the Brits would realize that Egypt was a hot mess, start to doubt that Nasser could maintain control, and decide to stay put to protect their interests in the Canal Zone. That was the goal. That was it. But all did not go well. Not at all. The Jewish operatives were caught. 4 Jews were killed and 8 other lives were ruined. When Israelis looked to the authorities for answers, they got evasions, cover-ups, and lies that destroyed their trust in their own government. That's the basic outline. You got all that? Super easy to follow, right? Not at all complicated or depressing or absurd. But that's how we roll on Unpacking Israeli History. We're going to tell the more holistic story of Israeli history, no matter how hard it might be to hear for some of you sometimes, or for me to research and read. But that's what we do, because that's the only way to really know the story, the only way to really understand this place. The Lavon affair was one of those watershed moments that punctured and complicated and in some ways reaffirmed the stories that Israelis told themselves about themselves, the stories that Jews told themselves about Israel. It is an example of the power and endurance of certain types of myths, of the kind of love and solidarity that can't be killed or tortured out of existence. And by the end of next week, because it's going to be 2 episodes, because it's just so much going on here, I hope the people at the heart of this, quote, rotten business and the stories they told themselves are as real to you as they became to me over the course of my research. So here goes. The full, twisty-turny, sometimes shocking story of the Lavon affair. In this episode, we're going to cover the historical background, introduce the mission, and unveil a plot twist. Next week, we'll get up close and personal with the cell and explore the decades-long aftermath of this scandal. 2 weeks, 2 episodes, 1 complicated story. Chapter 1, The Gentleman. I'm going to introduce you to a new term I learned. Local Egyptians called them the Hawagat, Arabic for gentleman. A half-mocking, half-reverent title for the foreigners who began flocking to Egypt at the end of the 19th century. Most were some flavor of European, Greek, Italian, Maltese, and then there were the Jews. A number had lived in Egypt for centuries, but many had arrived more recently, never intending to stay very long. Wherever they came from, and no matter how long they stayed, most Jews in Egypt had one thing in common. They may have lived in Egypt, they may have been born in Egypt, but they would never, ever be viewed as real Egyptians. I want to be clear. This sense of exclusion didn't start as some evil master plan to strip Jews of rights. When Egypt came under Ottoman rule in the 16th century, all non-Muslim monotheists in the empire became dhimmi, which means second-class citizens who received certain protections in exchange for attacks. But when European powers rolled into the region, they started striking deals with Ottoman sultans known as capitulations, which ensured that quote-unquote foreigners in Egypt, whether European or from elsewhere in the Ottoman Empire, would have their own courts, their own property laws, and the protection of whatever empire they had come from. Though this 2-tiered system might sound odd or discriminatory to us, it held all the way through 1918 when the Ottoman Empire collapsed and Egypt became a British protectorate. Now, right now, I'm going back to my college Middle East courses. I just remember studying capitulations. I did well on that test, by the way. So while many Egyptian Jews held European citizenship, the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire left a significant number without any nationality or state. Despite that, most Egyptian Jews were wealthier and more educated than the average Muslim Egyptian, enjoying the benign neglect of the authorities in the little bubble they had built for themselves. Like other Hawagat, they lived in their own neighborhoods and attended their own schools, solved disputes in their own courts, and socialized in their own clubs. Most barely spoke or read Egyptian Arabic, instead conducting their lives in a mix of something like French, English, Italian, Ladino, even Hebrew. And most rarely interacted with the average Egyptian Muslim. The sole exception was the Karaites. Nerd corner alert. Karaites are a fascinating breakaway Jewish sect that does not accept rabbinic authority. According to the most reliable place for information that's out there, Wikipedia, there are about 30 to 50,000 Karaites today. Fascinating group. Also, by the way, a Karaite student went to my high school with me, so just so you know. I also have a friend who has identified as being a Karaite, but then I realized he's just not interested in keeping the rabbinic laws, like observing the second day of Jewish holidays when living outside Israel. We can explore this whole concept another time. Not the same thing as being a Karaite, though. Not the same thing. Okay, anyway, let's get back to this. Karaites, yes. Karaites. Historically, Karaites and rabbinic Jews have had plenty of disagreements, but in Egypt, the two communities maintained a friendly relationship. Unlike Egypt's other Jews, the Karaites primarily spoke Arabic, and they mingled a lot more with the locals. Still, like all of Egypt's other Jews, they lived in their own neighborhood, abutting the Jewish quarter, acutely conscious of their status as minorities. Many became passionate Zionists, which until the 1930s wasn't a particularly controversial status to have in Egypt. For decades, Egyptian Jews fundraised for the cause. They visited the Holy Land, they attended Zionist conferences, or they organized Zionist youth groups without fear or harassment. But as the situation in Palestine, that's what it was called then, went from bad to really, really, really bad, Egyptians began scrutinizing their Jewish Hawagat a little more critically. You love when I say Hawagat. I know you do. You have no idea what Hawagat is, but now you do. Hawagat. Okay, I'll say it probably a little more, but like Hawagat. There you go. Anyway, pressure grew. On the eve of World War II, the heads of the Egyptian Jewish community begged the country's Zionists to stop being so public about the whole Jewish homeland thing, eventually denouncing the movement altogether. Extremist movements, whether communist, ultranationalist, or Islamist, codified anti-Semitism as a plank of their platforms. Members of Young Egypt, aka the Green Shirts, put together lists of Jewish-owned businesses to target, while the organization's, quote, proclamation of solidarity with Palestinian Arabs blamed the existence of, quote, Jewish industry for destroying Egyptian businesses. Meanwhile, Young Egypt's sworn enemies, the Muslim Brotherhood, had some equally troubling views on Jews. When the Grand Mufti Haj Amina Husseini came to Egypt in 1946, the head of the Muslim Brotherhood wrote an effusive letter welcoming, quote, ready for this? This hero who challenged an empire and fought Zionism with the help of Hitler and Germany. Germany and Hitler are gone, but Amina Husseini will continue the struggle. Okay, well, this isn't really surprising considering that of all Egypt's radical groups, the Muslim Brothers were particularly enthralled by the Nazi propaganda and funding that had made its way to Egypt. Soon, groups like the Muslim Brotherhood and the Green Shirts were organizing boycotts of Jewish businesses, setting off bombs in synagogues, and targeting private residences before graduating to full-on riots and pogroms. The writing was on the wall, and the company law of 1947 made this situation 10 times worse. In 1947, less than a third of Egyptian citizens were gainfully employed, with a disproportionate number of white-collar jobs going to the relatively more educated and affluent Hawagat. So the government passed a law mandating that effective immediately, between 75 and 90% of the workforce must be Egyptian citizens. Okay? Overnight, thousands of Jews and other Hawagat lost their jobs and any hope of future employment. Shortly after that, the state of Israel declared independence, and then all hell really broke loose for Egypt's Jews, as authorities froze Jewish assets and arrested hundreds of Jews on the most tenuous of suspicions, shoving many in squalid detention camps. Meanwhile, on Egyptian college campuses, the Muslim Brotherhood began a targeted campaign of harassment, beatings, and boycotts of Jewish students, even preventing Jews from entering the lecture halls. I feel like this is just not history people talk about or learn about. Like, I just said that all out loud. I'm like, that is just not something people know about. But now you do. With no institutional protection, Jews dropped out of college in record numbers, fully aware that they had no future in Egypt. By 1950, Egypt's Jewish population had been cut in half. Only 40 to 45,000 Jews remained in the country, clustered mostly in Cairo and Alexandria. In the wake of this mass exodus, Israel's small intelligence and sabotage networks in Egypt collapsed. If Israeli intelligence wanted to keep a close eye on their biggest, most powerful enemy, they would have to start recruiting. and they knew exactly where to start. Chapter 2, Eyes on the Horizon, Ears to the Ground. Avraham Dar probably didn't know that his new identity was lifted straight from the pages of Peter Pan. But his alias, John Darling, had a few things in common with his literary namesake. To start, he was British. More importantly, he didn't exist. Because John Darling was a fiction, a British traveling salesman who had come to Egypt in 1951 to open up a new market for the electrical equipment he sold. It was a strong cover for the Jerusalem-born Avraham Dar, who was actually in Egypt to build an espionage network on behalf of Israel's military intelligence apparatus, Amman. Nerd Corner alert, this is an important one. You may have heard of the Mossad. Actually, I'm pretty sure you have definitely heard of the Mossad, Israel's foreign intelligence agency. Even people who have no idea what Judaism is or Israel is, they've somehow heard of the Mossad. Anyway, if you haven't heard of the Mossad for whatever reason, check out our episode about the Mossad, which is awesome, by the way, and link in the show notes. Amman is not Mossad. Amman is not the Mossad. It's different. It's another plank of Israel's intelligence services focused on military intelligence. The third plank is known as the Shin Bet, or Shabak, which focuses on domestic security. We plan to do an episode on Amman and Shin Bet soon, so stay tuned. It's going to be awesome. Anyway, back to the story. No one knew exactly what this espionage network would do. There was no big plan, no concrete directives, just find some folks who might be useful, who could keep their ears close to the ground and share any information that might interest Israeli intelligence. Dar found 8, 7 men, 1 woman, though honestly, they were barely adults. Most were teenagers or in their very early 20s, and they had all the passion and the energy and starry-eyed idealism you'd expect from teenagers and young adults that age, which is also a nice way of saying that they were incredibly naive. Like, whoa. I don't say that to blame them. I was 18 once too, and I doubt I would have been a fraction as brave as they were. I am 100% sure I would not be, okay? I was like nervous to play ping pong against someone a little bit better than me when I was 18. I don't know. That was a ridiculous example, Noam, but you get the point. But anyway, one of the recruits later told a journalist, this is what they said, when it was a matter of contributing to the security of Israel, we were at an age and in a frame of mind when we were quite prepared to march blindfolded after big words. Of course, by the time he gave this interview, this young recruit was no longer so young or so naive. But we'll get there. It didn't seem to matter to Dar or to Amman leadership that only a couple members of the cell spoke or understood Arabic, which to me feels like a basic requirement for an agent in an enemy country. John Darling was looking for smart, capable, and above all committed recruits, and he got that 10 times over. And maybe if he had stayed in charge of the operation, things would have worked out differently for everyone. But Darling's assignment was to put together cells in Alexandria and Cairo and to begin training them for an as yet undetermined purpose. It wasn't to coordinate or plan their actions. So when he was called back to Israel a few months after establishing the 2 cells, he was confident that his recruits had everything they needed, especially after they secretly trickled one by one into Israel for specialized training. In Israel, they learned to assemble and disassemble all sorts of explosives, how to make and break codes, how to build secret weapons caches, how to transmit secret messages, and develop surveillance photographs and identify the different types of ships that docked at the Alexandria harbor. On the weekends, they toured Israel, basking in its unexpected familiarity. Here were all the places they had read about in the Bible, in Zionist literature, the springs of Ein Gedi, the coast of Tel Aviv, the hot sands of Eilat. Many years later, one of the recruits reflected that memories of these weekend tours were all that sustained him during the 14 years he would later spend in prison. But there were many things the recruits did not learn, like what to do if Egyptian intelligence officers came sniffing around, how to identify and shake surveillance, how to withstand torture, how to escape. As the recruits trained for their undetermined secret mission, Egypt was changing. 1952 brought not just a new head of state, but a whole new system of government. The monarchy was out. Military rule was in. After decades of foreign control, Egyptian patriotism took on a distinctly Arab tinge. And though Egypt's new leader, Mohammed Naguib, reassured Hawagat communities that everything would be fine, Egyptian Jews found themselves taunted or worse in the streets. The mob's slur of choice, ready for this? Sayuni. What does that mean? Zionist. That's right. Naguib's assurances crumbled in 1954 when Gamal Abdel Nasser took charge of the country. Nasser was young, he was handsome, charismatic, and disciplined, a military man from a working-class family. He was plain-spoken, savvy, and deeply committed to restoring his beloved country to its ancient glory, a vision that did not include making nice with Egypt's tiny northeastern neighbor. At first, however, Nasser's primary focus wasn't Israel, but Britain, which had more or less controlled Egypt since 1882. Once the Brits secured their 44% share in the company that operated the Suez Canal, they proved very hard to dislodge. The canal generated massive amounts of revenue for the French and British shareholders, all while ordinary Egyptians did their best to scrape together a living. Nasser was tired of it. He was sick of it. So were the communists, the ultranationalists, and the Islamists running around Egypt. They may have disagreed about what an ideal society looked like, but the hatred of the Brits and of Western imperialism generally managed to unite these groups around a common enemy. I probably don't need to say that they also detested Jews, right? And because of the old capitulations, remember those? Not to mention the existence of the State of Israel, it became very easy for radical groups of all stripes to paint Jews as agents of imperialism, a fifth column bringing Egypt down from the inside. As you might imagine, the rotten business only further confirmed this belief. Nasser agreed with the radicals on one thing. Their beloved Egypt could become the mightiest civilization on earth, but only once it dislodged the Western imperialist powers that had bled the country dry. The radicals' response was to set off bombs anywhere these Westerners might congregate, whether in the cinemas that showed Western movies or the British military installations protecting the canal. They also sabotaged British infrastructure and sent snipers to pick off British soldiers, but it was the bombing of civilian targets, including Jewish neighborhoods, that tipped their extracurricular activities over into terrorism. Now, Nasser didn't have a problem with terrorism per se, as long as it didn't affect his country. You might remember from previous episodes that he funded, trained, and armed Palestinian infiltrators into Israel, as well as Algerian rebels fighting the French occupation by setting off bombs in cafes. But he didn't want terrorists sowing chaos in his country. He was savvy enough to understand that the only way to get the Brits out of his country was to reassure them that their exit wouldn't affect their bottom line, which meant he had to play up Egypt's stability and his own prowess as a leader. So he rounded up radicals in droves, torturing and executing Muslim brothers by the hundreds. He entered negotiations with the Brits, promising to maintain the canal and even to allow British soldiers to defend it if war broke out. And the Brits, who were tired of sending troops home in body bags, they were all too happy to talk. Meanwhile, Jerusalem panicked. The 80,000 British troops stationed along the canal zone were an excellent deterrent against a potential Egyptian invasion of Israel. While the Brits were around, the Egyptians couldn't cozy up to their enemies in the USSR, who were all too eager to supply the Arab bloc with shiny new weapons to use against the Jewish state. This wasn't merely paranoia. Spoiler alert, the USSR did in fact supply Egypt with $80 million worth of weapons in 1955, which is like a lot of money in today's currency. But this was 1954, and Jerusalem was desperate to stop the British pullout. It was time to activate the cells. Chapter 3, a plot twist. Avri Elad had done a lot of questionable things in his life. On paper, he was the perfect Israeli with stints in the Haganah's elite strike force as well as a British commando unit. As an intelligence officer during the War of Independence, he made the contacts necessary to turn espionage into a career. With his blonde hair and flawless German, he was the perfect agent to infiltrate the underground Nazi groups cropping up in post-war Germany, providing his handlers with excellent information. But in reality, the perfect Israeli had a serious rap sheet. He had been dismissed in disgrace from nearly every post he had ever held. He stole from fellow soldiers. He lied to his superiors. He profited handsomely during Israel's War of Independence by selling goods on the black market and ferrying civilians out of the city in military vehicles for a fee, of course. That's quite the move. Even his fridge was stolen from an Arab family who had fled during the war. This guy was something else. Meanwhile, his old army buddy was climbing the ranks of Israeli military intelligence. Colonel Motka Ben-Sur was in charge of the Egyptian sleeper cells that Avraham Dar, aka John Darling, had set up. You following this story? He decided that Avri Elad was the perfect guy to command them on the ground. Ben-Sur knew Elad had a checkered past. He understood that. But he had been reliable as an undercover SS officer, which is insane, by the way, exposing links between former Nazis and the Egyptians. Plus, Ben-Sur's boss, here's another name, Benjamin Givli, who was the head of the entire military intelligence apparatus, Amman, believed that former criminals made the best intelligence agents, working twice as hard as upstanding citizens to rehabilitate their reputations. Look, I watched Homeland, and I'm still into Fauda. We love a thriller starring a conflicted anti-hero with a dark past and an allergy to authority. But this wasn't a slick, high-budget thriller. It was a shoestring operation, poorly thought out, run by amateurs. And Avri Elad was not some noble but misunderstood rogue with the best intentions. He was a loudmouth and show-off who spun tall tales of his exploits to anyone who would listen. That is not a great quality for a spy. Even before he left for Egypt, he spent his time swanning around Germany, where he was supposed to be establishing his cover in a flashy green convertible, telling any Israeli he met that he was about to go on a dangerous, secret mission in Egypt. When his superiors found out, they were furious enough to consider dropping him from the mission entirely. But in the first of the many tragedies, errors, and baffling miscalculations that came to define the rotten business, Avri Elad just got a stern talking to about operational security. With his wrist duly slapped, he set off to Egypt as Paul Frank, a German businessman seeking his fortune. But Paul Frank, there's so many names here and they're made up. They're made up aliases. So stay with me. But Paul Frank was boring and Elad needed pizzazz if he was going to mingle with the upper crust of Egyptian and Hawagat society. So he simply made up a new identity, keeping the name but sprinkling in a touch of glamour. After all, no one was going to check if he was really an entrepreneur and mechanical engineer, right? What were they going to do? Force him to do equations in front of them? Y equals mx plus b. That's what I remember. Anyway, with his new, extremely flimsy quote-unquote cover in place, Elad immediately established himself in Egyptian high society where he stood out like a tropical bird. With his fancy, memorable car and his penchant for taking his new friends on lavish vacations, bankrolled, of course, by the Israeli government, Paul Frank, in quotes, soon became a fixture among Egypt's upper crust, which was crawling with Egyptian intelligence agents who instantly spotted Elad for what he really, really was. We'll never know exactly what the Egyptians said when they cornered him, though we can imagine the nature of the threats that hung unspoken in the air. But we do know that from the moment he established contact with the cells, Avri Elad was already working for the enemy. Every bomb they planted, every plot they concocted was planned and directed by the Egyptian authorities, who were beside themselves with joy over this tangled, actual Zionist operation that had just fallen into their laps. The two cells had no idea that the emissary from Israel, this mysterious former soldier serving the Jewish state, had actually handed them over to Egyptian intelligence on a silver platter. That a crooked agent, inexplicably trusted by negligent superiors, had taken advantage of their idealism, jerking them like puppets towards a tragic and inevitable conclusion. They thought they were helping their beloved ancestral homeland, but they never stood a chance. And that is where we're going to end for this week. Next week, we are going to dive into the sad story, the complicated story, the difficult story, the scandalous story, the Lavon affair and its fallout. We'll explore how Israelis reacted to the slow drip of details that the government failed to suppress. And we're going to wonder, why does this embarrassing story from Israel's past still matter today? Unpacking Israeli History is a production of Unpacked, an OpenDor Media brand. Follow us wherever you get your podcasts. If you enjoyed this episode, leave us a rating on Apple or Spotify. It really helps other people find our show. One more time, I love hearing from you, so email me at noam@unpacked.media. This episode was produced by Rifki Stern. Our team for this episode includes Adi Elbaz, Rob Pera, and Ari Schlacht. I'm your host, Noam Weissman. Thanks for being here. See you next week.